It is whispered in the forbidden archives of the Ordo Sepulchrum that the universe does not abhor a vacuum. It abhors perfection. For in perfection there is no growth, no decay, no life. We have long looked upon the sons of Mortarion as the ultimate stewards of entropy, the final, forwarded breath of a dying galaxy. But what happens when the entropy of materia meets a rot from beyond the stars? A rot that does not merely wither flesh, but births a new, terrible divinity? Deep within the weeping sores of the Scourge Stars, a rift is torn, not of the warp, but of something else. No demonic cackle heralded its arrival. Only the sickeningly sweet scent of uncounted lilies, and the sound of a prosthetic blade whispering against ceramite. Through the smog of chemdogs and the flies of Nurgle walks a specter of unyielding grace. Clad in unalloyed gold, her footsteps leaving a trail of blossoming nightmares. She is the undefeated blade. She is the goddess of unalloyed ruin. And today, the Death Guard shall learn that even the lore of decay can be outpaced by a swifter, more beautiful extinction. I am your narrator, and this is the Malenia Anomaly. The Segmentum Obscurus is a graveyard of light, a region where the Emperor's Astronomicon flickers like a dying candle against an oncoming storm. But within the subsector of the Scourge Stars, a new celestial anomaly has baffled the logic engines of the Adeptus Mechanicus. It began as a faint rhythmic pulse, not the jagged, screaming static of the warp, but harmonic vibration that hummed in the bones of every living soul. When the Imperial scout ship Eye of Vigilance entered the orbit of the world once known as Ocularis, they did not find the pockmarked, bile-slicked surface typical of Nurgle-infested rock. Instead, they found a world encased in a shimmering, crystalline amber, massive, subterranean roots, thick as titan legs and pale as bleached bone, had erupted through the planet's crust, reaching upward like the fingers of a buried god. These were the roots of the Haligtree, transplanted into a reality that knew only war. Yet here they grew with a terrifying, unnatural vigor. Down in the primary hive spire, the air had changed. The cloying, sulphurous smog of the hive's manufactorums had been replaced by a mist of fine, crimson dust, spores that tasted of ancient metal and wild, untamed flora. For the inquisitorial savant Vane, every step through the silent corridors was a descent into a dream. There were no bodies, at least not in the traditional sense. The hive workers and PDF soldiers had not rotted, they had blossomed. Their rib cages were forced open by erupting scarlet flowers. Their veins had turned into delicate vines. They stood like statues, frozen in the moment of their transformation, their faces twisted not in agony, but in a horrific, ecstatic trance. This was a corruption that did not seek to decay the flesh, but to overwrite it, to replace the messy biology of man with something more elegant, more singular, and infinitely more dangerous. At the heart of the hive's cathedral district, the source awaited. The great Gothic arches, once dedicated to the God Emperor, were now draped in thick, velvety moss and glowing fungi. In the center of the nave, where the altar once stood, sat a massive, unalloyed golden cocoon. It pulsed with soft, rhythmic light, casting long shadows against the statues of long-dead saints. Savant Vane's Auspex scanner whined in protest, its needle spinning wildly between Xenos and Erythric. There was no taint here, no sign of the four great powers of chaos. This was a purity that felt like a blade to the throat. As the savant approached, the surface of the cocoon began to hairline fracture. A warmth, dry and intense, radiated from the cracks, and the scent of rotting lilies became so thick it was almost suffocating. With a sound like breaking glass, the cocoon shattered. From the shards of gold stepped a figure that defied every tenet of imperial truth. She was tall, slender, and possessed a grace that made the movements of an Eldar seem clumsy. Her skin was a patchwork of pale flesh and ornate, golden prosthetics that integrated seamlessly into her form. A single, sweeping wing of crimson feathers partially unfurled from her shoulder, trailing spores like a regal cape. She did not scream. She did not roar. She simply reached down and picked up a long, curved blade of unalloyed gold that lay at her feet. As she fastened her winged helm, the visor catching the dim light, the atmosphere of the entire planet seemed to hold its breath. She was Malenia, and the very ground beneath her prosthetic feet began to calcify into a garden of Scarlet Rot. The peace, however, was a lie. Above the hive, the sky began to churn with familiar, sickly green lightning. The grandfather had noticed the intruder. Nurgle, the lord of all things, does not take kindly to those who plant gardens in his domain without his blessing. The clouds parted to reveal the bloated, pustule-covered hulls of Death Guard warships, their engines groaning like dying beasts. Drop pods, shaped like rusted flies, began to rain from the heavens, streaking through the amber atmosphere. As the first pod slammed into the cathedral square, spilling forth the stinking, armored bulk of the Plague Marines, Malenia did not flinch. She simply adjusted her stance, the golden blade whispering as it moved through the air. The golden spore had taken root, and now the harvesters of the 14th Legion had arrived to see if they could reap what she had sown. High above the blooming catastrophe of Ocularis, the Endurance, the massive, pitted flagship of the Death Guard, hung in the void like a bloated tick. On its bridge, the air was a thick soup of recycled filth and incense made from dry bile. Lord Felthius, a master of contagion whose armor was a rusted cage for 1,000 different plagues, stared at the Vox screens with narrow, milky eyes. The reports from the surface were nonsensical. His plague seers claimed the warp was silent, yet the planet was changing. The chaotic, joyful decay of Nurgle was being replaced by something structured, something almost beautiful. To Felthius, this was the ultimate heresy. To rot was to be part of the grandfather's cycle. To bloom, as this planet was doing, was an act of defiance against the very nature of entropy. With a grunt that sounded like wet gravel shifting in a tomb, he signaled the descent. The 14th Legion would not merely invade. They would debride this world like a surgeon cutting out a tumor. The sky over the hive city turned the color of a bruised lung as the Death Guard Stormbird transports roared through the atmosphere. Unlike the quick, surgical strikes of other Astartes, the 14th Legion descended with a heavy, grinding inevitability. As the ramps of the drop pods hissed open, the first sound to greet the planet was a rhythmic, dissonant tolling of the tox bells. 7 times the bells rang, each note a physical wave of nausea that should have liquefied the internal organs of any mortal listener. Plague Marines of the 7th Plague Company stepped out into the scarlet mist, their power armor covered in weeping sores and verdigris. They moved with a slow, shambling gait that belied their terrifying strength, their respirators huffing out clouds of weaponized typhus. They expected to find a world in its death throes, ready to be folded into Nurgle's garden. Instead, they found a battlefield that looked like a painting of a fevered dream. The Death Guard pushed into the industrial sectors, their plague spurt gauntlets dousing the fluoro-mutated hive workers in corrosive sludge. But something was wrong. Usually, Nurgle's rot brings a slow, sluggish end, but the Scarlet Rot of the Haligtree fought back with a predatory ferocity. When the Plague Marines' acids hit the moss-covered walls, the plants did not wither. They mutated instantly, growing jagged thorns that pierced ceramite and drinking the toxic sludge as if it were life-giving rain. The very environment was sentient and hostile. A group of Blightlord Terminators found themselves surrounded by Cleanrot apparitions, shadowy flickers of Malenia's influence that darted through the crimson fog. For the first time in 10,000 years, the sons of Mortarion felt a flicker of something they had long forgotten, the realization that they were not the only masters of biological warfare in the galaxy. Lord Felthius himself made planetfall in the center of the hive's primary transit hub, flanked by a shroud bodyguard. He looked down at a patch of scarlet bloom at his feet. He reached out a gauntlet, intending to crush the delicate flower, but as his fingers brushed the petals, a searing pain shot through his nervous system. The rot was trying to infect him. It was a competitive entropy, a faster, more aggressive strain of ruin that didn't wait for permission to settle. Felthius roared a wet, phlegm-filled sound and swung his man-reaper scythe, cleaving through a nearby pillar of roots. "This is a false rot," he bellowed into the Vox. "A gilded deception. Burn the flowers. Let nothing remain but the holy slime of the Lord of all." His warriors responded by unleashing their heavy flammers, the chemical fire turning the scarlet mist into an orange inferno. As the fires raged, a high-pitched, melodic whistle began to drown out the roar of the flammers and the groans of the dying. It was a sound of air being sliced with impossible precision. From the heights of the hive spire, a golden blur descended. Malenia did not fall. She seemed to drift down on the heat of the fires, her prosthetic arm gleaming like a dying sun. She landed in the center of the Death Guard formation, the impact creating a shockwave of red spores that extinguished the chemical flames instantly. The plague Marines leveled their bolters, but their auto senses struggled to lock onto her. She stood amidst the giants of the XIV Legion, a slender reed of gold in a sea of rusted iron. Felthius stepped forward, his side dripping with black ichor. The two forces of decay stood face to face. The ancient, slow-rotting history of the Long War versus the sudden, blossoming apocalypse of the lands between. The silence that followed Malenia's landing was heavier than the smog of Barbarous. To the Death Guard, time was a slow, agonizing crawl, a gift from Nurgle that allowed them to endure any wound. But as the blade of Miquella rose from her crouch, the tempo of the universe seemed to fracture. Sergeant Kolos of the 7th Company raised his bolter, his finger tightening on the trigger, but before the firing pin could strike the primer, Malenia was gone. She did not run. She flickered. A golden line traced itself through the air, and Kolos felt a strange lack of resistance in his midsection. He looked down to see his ancient, rot-hardened power armor, plate that had withstood tank shells, sever as cleanly as a hot wire through wax. His twin hearts, swollen with the grandfather's parasites, beat once more before they were sliced into ribbons. He fell not with a roar, but with a wet, confused thud, the first harvest of a reaper faster than any the XIV Legion had ever encountered. Chaos erupted in the transit hub. The Death Guard, masters of the relentless advance, found themselves fighting a ghost made of gold and fury. Malenia moved in a blurred orbit around the squad, her prosthetic arm hiss-clicking with every lethal adjustment. The plague Marines opened fire, their bolter rounds exploding in wet thuds against the ground and walls, but a girl in a winged helm was always a millisecond ahead of the blast. She was a dancer in a charnel house, her blade, hand of Malenia, whistling a song of absolute finality. Every strike she landed did more than just cut. It injected a concentrated essence of Scarlet Rot directly into Marines' corrupted bloodstreams. The Death Guard, who prided themselves on being the ultimate host for disease, found their own bodies rejecting this new, alien infection. Their bloated flesh began to crystallize, turning into brittle, red-veined husks that shattered under the weight of their own armor. "Formation Alpha!" bellowed a plague champion, swinging a heavy mace encrusted with filth. The Marines pulled into a tight defensive circle, overlapping their field of fire and unleashing a wall of plague fire and bile. They sought to drown her in the very essence of stagnation. For a moment, Malenia disappeared behind a curtain of green, corrosive gas. The Death Guard waited, their auto senses searching for a corpse. Instead, they heard a soft, rhythmic tapping, the sound of metal on stone. Out of the toxic cloud she walked, her unalloyed gold armor untouched by the acid. The Scarlet Rot she carried was not just a disease. It was a divine manifestation that viewed Nurgle's gifts as mere fertilizer. She raised her blade, the edge glowing with a faint, malevolent red light, and the air around her began to vibrate with the hum of 1,000 invisible wings. Then came the waterfowl dance. It was a spectacle of such horrific beauty that even the stoic Death Guard froze in momentary awe. Malenia leaped into the air, suspended by a sheer that defied the planet's gravity. She became a sphere of shimmering gold and cutting edges, a whirlwind of slashes that descended upon the center of the Death Guard formation. Ceramite hissed as it was shredded. Bones snapped like dry kindling. The Shroud Bodyguard, Felthius's elite, tried to intercept her with their size, but their movements were tectonic compared to her lightning strike velocity. In the span of 3 heartbeats, 6 veterans of the Long War were reduced to a heap of severed limbs and leaking armor. The blood that pooled on the floor did not stay red. It immediately began to sprout tiny, aggressive fungi that hungrily consumed the spilled ichor of the Chaos Marines. Lord Felthius watched his finest warriors fall, a cold pit of dread forming in his gut, a feeling he hadn't known since the Siege of Terra. This was not a battle of endurance. It was a slaughter of efficiency. Malenia came to a halt, her blade pointed at the ground, a single drop of thick, black Death Guard blood sliding off the golden tip. She looked at Felthius, and though her eyes were hidden behind her winged helm, he felt the gaze of a goddess who looked upon him not as a threat, but as an obstacle to be pruned. Behind her, the massive roots of the Haligtree groaned, pulsing with new, dark energy harvested from the fallen Astartes. The first harvest was complete, and as the scarlet spores began to settle over the carnage, the Death Guard realized they weren't the hunters on this world. They were the soil. From the shadowed balconies of the transit hub, Sorcerer Plotinus of the 14 Legion watched the carnage with a cold, analytical detachment, while his brother saw only a frenetic Xenos witch. His psychic sight saw something far more terrifying. To the warp attuned, the universe is a sea of shifting energies, but around Malenia, the warp did not shift, it curdled. She was a void of unalloyed gold, a walking anathema that did not just resist the psychic influence of Nurgle, but actively bleached it from existence. Plotinus channeled the winds of the Imperium, preparing a curse that had rotted entire regiments of the Astra Militarum from the inside out. He whispered the forbidden incantations of the sevenfold path, directing a stream of psychic bile toward the red-winged specter. Yet, as the spell approached her, it did not strike, it withered. The virulent energy of the warp turned into harmless, falling petals of dried ash. Malenia did not even look up. Her mere presence was a sovereign domain that rejected the laws of the great corrupter. Plotinus realized with a jolt of psychic feedback that this Scarlet Rot was not a mere disease of the flesh, but a fundamental law of a different reality. It was a biological entropy that functioned with the precision of a clockmaker. Where Nurgle's rot was stagnant and slow, a muddy swamp of life and death, Malenia's rot was an aggressive, predatory evolution. It consumed the old to fuel a sudden, violent bloom. He watched through his staff's crystal eye as a fallen battle brother tried to regenerate his wounds through Nurgle's blessing. Instead of the flesh knitting back together in a mess of tumors, the Scarlet Rot accelerated the process so violently that the Marine's entire body turned into a giant, pulsating fungi in seconds. It wasn't just killing them. It was using the Death Guard's own legendary resilience as a high-calorie fuel source for its own expansion. It is an infestation of the soul. Plotinus hissed into the Vox network, his voice cracking like dry parchment. She is not a demon, but she is a goddess of a different order. Every drop of our blood she spills is a seed planted in the Imperium. He realized the danger too late. The waterfowl dance he had just witnessed wasn't merely a combat maneuver. It was a ritual of dissemination. Every arc of her blade had scattered millions of microspores into the air, and now, the very atmosphere of the hive was becoming a lethal, pressurized chamber of Scarlet Rot. The Death Guard's ancient rebreather units began to fail. The filters clogged not by grime, but by rapidly growing floral filaments that pushed their way through the reinforced seals. Malenia began to move again, but this time, she targeted the heavy weapon team's position on the upper gantries. She leaped with a grace that mocked the heavy gravity of the hive, her prosthetic feet sticking to the vertical surfaces of the Gothic pillars as she ran upward. A plague marine armed with a multi-melta tried to track her, but the heat of his weapon only seemed to excite the spores in the air. As he fired, the beam of superheated slag was caught in a whirlwind of golden steel. Malenia didn't just dodge the melta burst. She sliced through the air so fast she created a vacuum that redirected the heat. In a heartbeat, she was behind him. With a single fluid motion, she decapitated the giant and kicked his convulsing body off the ledge, his armor bursting into a cloud of red dust before he even hit the ground. Below, the Death Guard were losing their characteristic composure. They were used to being the inevitable tide that drowned their enemies in filth. Now, they were the ones being drowned in a sea of scarlet beauty. Plotinus felt a tremor in the warp, a distant, rhythmic thudding that signaled the approach of something massive. The Death Guard were bringing in the heavy armor, the demon engines that roared with the hunger of the warp. But Malenia stood atop the highest gantry, looking down at the rusted tanks beginning to roll into the square. She extended her golden arm, and the roots of the Haligtree beneath the floor responded, tearing through the ferrocrete with a sound like a world breaking apart. The skirmish was over. The war for the planet's very essence had begun. The ground groaned under the weight of the 14 Legion's iron fist. Into the cathedral square lumbered the plague-burst crawlers, their massive mortar muzzles angled like the mouths of hungry, metal gods. These were not mere machines. They were semi-sentient demonic engines, their hulls encrusted with a century's worth of filth and prayers to the Lord of Silence. Behind them, Mephitic blight haulers skittered on 3 rusted treads, their multi-meltas glowing with a hateful, slag-orange light. The Death Guard had realized that flesh, even the augmented flesh of a transhuman, was too fragile for this foe. They shifted their strategy to the cold, unfeeling logic of the machine. Lord Felthius gave a command from his Voxcaster, and the air was suddenly torn apart by the rhythmic thundering of heavy artillery. Each shell was filled with concentrated moribus toxin, designed to melt organic matter into a primordial soup. The barrage hit with the force of a falling moon. The cathedral district was swallowed in a sequence of emerald explosions that sent shrapnel and caustic bile flying hundreds of meters. The delicate scarlet flowers and the pale roots of the Haligtree were doused in a rain of melting acid. For a moment, it seemed the mechanical brutality of the 41st Millennium had finally triumphed over the ancient grace of the lands between. The Death Guard sensors registered a massive spike in toxicity. Nothing biological should have survived that saturation. But as the smoke cleared, the engine demons let out a collective, screeching mechanical hiss. There, amidst the craters and the bubbling sludge, stood Malenia. She had not retreated. She had used the very ruins of cathedral as a shield, and her unalloyed gold armor acted as a lightning rod for the caustic energies, grounding the corruption before it could touch her skin. Before the crawlers could reload, Malenia retaliated. She did not charge the tanks directly. She moved toward a Mephitic blight hauler that was repositioning for a flank. The demon engine roared, its front-mounted maw snapping as its sensor approached. It unleashed a stream of superheated meltifier, but Malenia pirouetted through the heat, her red wing cape fluttering like a phoenix in the embers. She leaped onto hulled machine, her golden prosthetic arm punching through the reinforced ceramite plating, as if it were parchment. With a sharp, rhythmic twist of her blade, she severed the demon brain housed within the chassis. The machine didn't just stop. It began to convulse. The Scarlet Rot she had injected into its core was consuming the logic of the machine, turning its mechanical fluids into a thick, floral ichor that caused the tank to bloom from the inside out. The other engines turned their weapons toward their fallen comrade. But Malenia was already gone, a golden phantom weaving between the lumbering giants. She understood the geometry of the battlefield with a cold, martial instinct. She led the lumbering plague-burst crawlers into a narrow corridor of massive Haligtree roots that had erupted from the sublevel. As the tanks entered the kill zone, the roots constricted. These were not mere plants. They were the vascular system of a nascent goddess. The roots tightened around the hulls of the crawlers, that were becoming as hard as adamantium. Steel plates buckled and popped under the pressure, and the demons trapped within the tanks screamed through their vox grills as the Cleanrot began to eat through their warped flesh and iron casings alike. High above mechanical carnage, a greater blight drone descended, its 3 rusted fans buzzing like a swarm of angry hornets. It unleashed a torrent of plague breath from its nozzle, aiming to blanket the entire sector in a lethal fog. Malenia looked up, her helm reflecting the sickly green glow of the drone's eye. With a single explosive leap, she launched herself 50 meters into the air, her blade extended. She didn't just strike the drone, she passed through it. In midair, she executed a miniature version of her waterfowl dance, shredding the drone's rotors and its bloated flesh bag in a single second of suspended motion. As she landed gracefully amidst the wreckage of a 1 billion-credit tank division, the Death Guard understood. Their engines were not the apex predators of this world. They were merely larger targets for the blade of Miquella. The Scarlet Rot did not merely destroy, it conscripted. As the Death Guard fell, the planet Ocularis began to birth a new breed of warrior from the compost of the fallen. The Imperial Hive workers and the less corrupted PDF soldiers, once trapped in a floral trance, began to stir. Their bodies had been completely rebuilt by the goddess's influence. Their skin had hardened into a pale, chitinous substance that mimicked the look of unalloyed gold, and their eyes glowed with soft, haunting crimson light. They rose from the mounds of moss and shattered ceramite, picking up rusted spears and serrated scythes that had been transformed by the rot into weapons of terrifying potency. These were the Cleanrot Knights of the 41st Millennium, a silent, disciplined host that stood in stark contrast to the shambling, chaotic masses of Nurgle's poxwalkers. The transformation was not limited to the weak. Even some of the fallen Death Guard, those whose souls had been abandoned by Nurgle in the face of the superior entropy, found themselves reborn. Their rusted power armor was overtaken by gold-hued lichen, and their bloated forms were streamlined by the aggressive evolution of the Haligtree. These rot walkers retained their Astartes strength, but gained the unnatural speed of Malenia's brood. They formed a phalanx around their goddess, their movements synchronized by a shared, silent consciousness. When the next wave of Death Guard infantry pushed forward, they were met not by a lone duelist, but by a disciplined wall of golden-red spears. The clash was a cacophony of metal on metal, but where the Death Guard fought with the weight of exhaustion, the Cleanrot Knights fought with the frantic, endless energy of a blossoming forest. A three-way battle erupted across the Hive City. The remaining Imperial PDF, terrified and insane, fired their lost guns blindly into the fog, hitting both the rusted giants and the golden specters. The Death Guard found themselves pinned between the unclean Rot they served and the clean Rot they feared. Lord Felthius watched as his formation disintegrated. His plague marines, who usually ignored wounds that would fell a carnifex, were being systematically dismantled. The spears of the Cleanrot Knights carried a necrotizing agent that didn't just rot flesh, it rotted the warp soul. Every stab was a severance from Nurgle's grace. For the first time, the Death Guard were experiencing the true death, a finality that their grandfather's cycle was supposed to protect them from. Malenia stood at the center of this new army, her presence acting as a tactical hub. She did not need to shout orders. Her knights moved as an extension of her own nervous system. When she raised her blade, the phalanx advanced. When she pointed at a heavy bolter nest, a dozen knights leaped with supernatural agility, scaling the walls to silence the guns with their rot-infused sides. The atmosphere of the city had become so saturated with spores that the very air was a weapon. The Imperial soldiers who weren't transformed were simply dissolved, their lungs turning into gardens of scarlet fungus within minutes. The hive was no longer a human habitation. It was a sprawling golden-red womb for a new species. High above, the Death Guard's aerial support attempted to carpet-bomb the new Cleanrot district with phosphine and incendiaries. But as the bombs fell, the Cleanrot Knights raised their spears in a ritualistic gesture. From the roots of the Haligtree, a massive barrier of golden light and drifting spores erupted, catching the ordnance in midair and detonating it harmlessly against a psychic shield of unalloyed purity. Malenia looked toward the horizon, where the massive, side-shaped silhouette of Mortarion's personal shuttle was beginning its descent. She knew the masters of this galaxy would not go quietly, but as she looked at her growing army of golden, red-winged horrors, she knew she was no longer a stranger in this universe. She was its new, inevitable gardener. The arrival of Calotifon, known now as Typhus, herald of the plague god, was heralded by a sound that drowned out even the screams of the dying, the deafening, tectonic drone of the destroyer hive. As his massive, Terminator-armored form stepped from the teleportarium flare, the very air around him curdled into a thick, black sludge of flies. Typhus did not share Lord Felthius's caution or Mortarion's brooding curiosity. To him, Malenia was an affront, a weed in the grandfather's garden that required the most violent of prunings. He raised his Man-Reaper, the ancient-side Man-Reaper dripping with quintessence of every plague known to the warp, and pointed it at the golden figure atop the central spire. With a gesture, he unleashed the hive. A billion black, biting insects erupted from the chimneys on his back, a literal cloud of death that moved like a sentient shadow, intending to strip the flesh from Malenia's bones in a matter of seconds. Malenia watched the oncoming black tide with stillness that was unnerving. As the destroyer hive reached her, she did not retreat. Instead, she began a series of slashes, so precise they seemed to cut the air itself into ribbons. Each movement of her golden blade created a vacuum of Scarlet Rot, a vacuum that didn't just kill the flies but subverted them. The insects bred in the warp-foul gut of Typhus began to change color in midair. Their black carapaces turned a sickly, translucent red. Their chaotic buzzing synchronized into a melodic hum. Malenia was not fighting the swarm. She was reclaiming it. The destroyer hive, Nurgle's most loyal messengers, turned their fury back upon their master. Typhus roared in disbelief as his own swarm began to bite into the seals of his cataphractii armor. injecting a rot that even his hardened constitution found agonizing. Infuriated, the Herald of Nurgle charged. The ground cracked beneath his massive boots as he swung his scythe in a wide, devastating arc designed to cleave a tank in two. Malenia met the blow with her own blade. The sound of unalloyed gold striking the warp-forged iron of the Man-Reaper was like a thunderclap that shattered every pane of glass in the cathedral district. For a moment, it was a contest of pure strength. The sheer, mountain-moving weight of the Herald versus the unyielding, divine kinetic energy of the goddess. Sparks of green and red lightning danced at the point of contact. Typhus leaned his weight into the strike, his flies biting frantically at Malenia's helm, but she remained as immovable as the Haligtree itself, her prosthetic arm whining with the strain of mechanical and metaphysical power. With a sudden, fluid movement, Malenia disengaged, sliding down the length of the scythe's pole and delivering a series of rapid-fire thrusts into the joints of Typhus's armor. The Herald staggered, his movement slowed by the sudden onset of crystallization in his knee joints. He realized too late that Malenia's rot was a parasitic drain. She was literalizing the concept of bloom by siphoning the vast, stagnant energy of his body to fuel her own speed. He swung again, a desperate horizontal sweep, but Malenia leaped over the blade, her red wing unfurling to its full, terrible span. In the air, she was a goddess of ruin, the scarlet spores trailing behind her like the tail of a comet. She landed behind him and, with a brutal efficiency, drove her blade to the power pack of his armor. The explosion of warp energy and coolant threw Typhus forward, forcing him to his knees for the first time in millennia. He spat a mouthful of black bile, his pride wounded deeper than his flesh. The Grave Warden had failed. Around him, his death guard retreated, seeing their champion humbled by a creature that didn't even use the warp. Malenia did not deliver the killing blow. She simply stood and watched as the scarlet roots began to entwine around Typhus's legs. Claiming the ground he stood on, she looked up at the sky, sensing a far greater presence approaching, a shadow that made Typhus look like a mere foot soldier. The Herald had been the prologue. The true master of the 14 Legion was coming to reclaim his sons, and Malenia was ready to show him that even a pre-march can wither. The atmosphere of Ocularis had reached a critical mass. The sky, once a sickly green, had deepened into a bruised, pulsating crimson. As Mortarion's shadow loomed ever closer, the resistance of the Death Guard intensified into a suicidal frenzy. They unleashed their forbidden alchemical stockpiles, drowning the hive in phosphex, a living, green fire that burned through bone and stone alike. The battlefield became a hellish paradox, a garden of beautiful, red flowers wreathed in the agonizing flames of a chemical apocalypse. Malenia, standing at the epicenter of this conflagration, felt the pressure of two dying worlds pressing against her. The unalloyed gold of her armor began to glow with an internal heat, not from the fires without, but from the power swelling within. She realized that the purity she sought could no longer be maintained through blade work alone. To defeat a god of stagnation, she would have to embrace her own divinity of ruin. The second bloom did not begin with a sound, but with a sudden, absolute vacuum of silence. Malenia dropped to her knees, her golden blade clattering to the ground as she clutched at her chest. Her prosthetic arm sparked violently, unable to contain the surge of metaphysical energy. From her back, the single red wing began to multiply and mutate, expanding into a massive, floral structure of scarlet feathers and ethereal light. The Death Guard paused their bombardment, their ancient sensors screaming warnings of a biological event of such magnitude that it mimicked the signature of a warp core breach. Malenia's form disappeared entirely, replaced by a massive, pulsating bud of scarlet energy that hovered meters above the scorched earth. Then the bloom opened. It was a tactical nuke of pure biological entropy. A shockwave of scarlet light erupted from the center of the hive, moving at the speed of sound. This was not a fire that burned. It was a wave of accelerated existence. As the light hit the Death Guard ranks, their 10,000-year-old armor did not melt. It aged millions of years in a heartbeat. Ceramite turned to dust, and the ancient warriors within were reduced to fungal soil before they could even utter a prayer to Nurgle. The phosphex fires were extinguished instantly, replaced by a carpet of Aeonian butterflies that fluttered through the ruins, their wings carrying the spores of a new world. The shockwave leveled every standing structure within 5 kilometers, leaving only the massive, indestructible roots of the Haligtree standing like the pillars of a new cathedral. At the center of the crater, the Goddess of Rot ascended. She no longer resembled the warrior maiden who had emerged from the cocoon. She was larger, her skin shimmering with a pale, divine luminescence, her wings now a magnificent, terrifying cloak of scarlet energy that bled spores into the air like a waterfall. She had become the Ionia, the embodiment of the very rot that had once been her curse. The air around her was so saturated with the Scarlet Rot that the laws of physics began to fray. Gravity was replaced by a gentle, upward drift of petals, and the silence was replaced by a low, melodic hum that resonated with the heartbeat of the planet itself. The second bloom had reclaimed Ocularis for the Haligtree, turning a hive world into a sacred lethal grove. High above, the Endurance shuddered as the shockwave hit its lower shields. The biological contamination, so potent, began to grow in the ship's exterior hull in the cold vacuum of space. Mortarion, standing in his sanctum, watched the red light consume the world below. He felt a rare sensation, a pang of genuine recognition. This was the end state he had always promised his sons, yet it was delivered by a hand that was not his own. The planet was now a beacon of Cleanrot, a challenge to the Lord of Silence that could no longer be ignored. As the goddess Malenia looked up toward the stars, her gaze pierced into the clouds to find the Primarch's ship. The stage was set for the final clash between the Pale King and the Goddess of Unalloyed Ruin. The heavens did not simply open, they tore. Mortarion, the Pale King, the demon Primarch of the 14 Legion, descended upon the wings of a moth god. He did not arrive with the frantic energy of his sons, but with a glacial, terrifying weight that seemed to flatten the very atmosphere. As his moth-like pinions beat against the scarlet air, clouds of silence, absolute and oppressive, smothered the melodic hum of the second bloom. He landed in the center of the crater, his cowl shadowing a face that was a mask of gaunt, immortal bitterness. In his right hand, he gripped Silence, the massive, energy-reaping scythe that had ended worlds. He looked upon Malenia, not as a monster to be slain, but as a rival architect of entropy. For the first time in millennia, two beings of pure, concentrated decay stood in the same space, and the universe groaned under the paradoxical pressure of their union. You bring a garden to a tomb, little thing. Mortarion's voice was a rasp of dry bone on rusted iron, projected not through the air but directly into the mind. He raised a lantern, his ancient energy pistol, and unleashed a beam of white-hot, alchemical fire that could vaporize a titan's leg. Malenia did not dodge. She glided. She moved with the weightless fluidity of a dream, her scarlet wings of light, leaving trails of glowing dust that intercepted the beam. The explosion of energy was swallowed by her aura, fueling her own radiance. She spoke no words, for her divinity was one of action, not rhetoric. With a sudden, explosive burst of speed, she closed the distance, her golden blade whistling toward the Primarch's throat. Mortarion parried with a haft of Silence, the impact sending a shockwave that cracked the continental plate beneath them. The duel that followed was a clash of fundamental philosophies. Mortarion fought with the relentless, crushing weight of the 14 Legion. Every swing of his scythe was a sentence of slow, inevitable death. Malenia fought with the frantic, beautiful violence of spring storm. Every thrust was an invitation to a sudden, blooming end. Silence carved through the air, leaving trails of black, oily warp ichor that ate at the ground, while Malenia's blade left ribbons of gold and scarlet. They moved in a blur of motion that defied the senses of any mortal observer. Mortarion unleashed his gift, a psychic miasma of such concentrated filth that the very air turned to liquid sludge. Malenia countered by blooming again. Not a full explosion, but a constant, localized aura of unalloyed purity that burned away the warp mist as soon as it touched her skin. As the battle escalated, the environment itself began to warp. The roots of the Haligtree rose from the earth like white krakens trying to ensnare the Primarch, while Mortarion's presence summoned swarms of bloated, demonic flies that clashed with Malenia's scarlet butterflies in a miniature war of the skies. Mortarion realized that he could not win a war of attrition against a being that fed on the very concept of growth. He plunged a blade of Silence into the earth, channeling the full, necrotic power of the Garden of Nurgle into the planet's core. The ground turned into a sea of black bile, a literal manifestation of the plague god's realm. Malenia was forced into the air, her wings flapping with a desperate, radiant intensity as she prepared her final gambit. High above the sea of filth, Malenia spun into the ultimate iteration of her waterfowl dance. She became a son of scarlet blades, a vortex of cutting light that descended upon the demon pre-march. Mortarion raised his scythe, his wings shielding his body as he braced for the impact. The collision was a cataclysm. The golden blade and the warp scythe locked, their energies screaming in a dissonant harmony that tore a rift in the Imperium. For a heartbeat, the two were frozen, the pale king of stagnation and the goddess of ruin, their eyes meeting in a moment of mutual horrific understanding. Neither could destroy the other, without destroying the concept of decay itself. As the rift expanded, a blinding flash of white and red light consumed them both, leaving the fate of Ocularis hanging in a balance that not even the gods could predict. The cataclysmic resonance between the pale king and the goddess did not end in a traditional victory, but in a horrific synthesis. As the rift in reality stabilized, the world of Ocularis was no longer a planet of the Imperium, nor a fiefdom of Nurgle. It had become the first unalloyed garden. The inquisitorial savant, watching from a shielded observation post on the system's edge, recorded the impossible. The warp and the Scarlet Rot had reached a state of predatory equilibrium. Mortarion, unable to crush this rival entropy, withdrew his fleet to the Scourge Stars, his silence a tacit admission that a new, untamable plague had been unleashed upon the galaxy. The Death Guard left behind millions of their brothers, but they were no longer dead. They had become the foundation of a new ecology, their rusted armor serving as a bark for trees that bled liquid gold. Across the Segmentum Obscurus, the Malenia Anomaly began to spread like a psychic wildfire. Astropaths on distant hive worlds screamed of visions featuring a single red wing and the scent of rotting lilies. This was a new threat to the Golden Throne, one that the Ordo Malus was ill-equipped to handle. Unlike the Chaos Gods, who hunger for souls, the Scarlet Rot seemed to hunger for form. It did not want to drag humanity into the warp. It wanted to rewrite the Imperium into a singular, blossoming nightmare. Reports filtered in of Cleanrot, cults emerging in the lower levels of Hive Primus, on worlds thousands of light years away. These cultists did not chant to the dark gods. They practiced a silent, rhythmic swordplay, their bodies slowly turning into living art as the spores took root in their marrow. The theoretical conclusion for the Warhammer Crossverse is one of escalating biological warfare. In this what a scenario, the presence of Malenia introduces a third pole to the great game of the gods. Nurgle, the Lord of Decay, now faces a rival who offers a more beautiful end, a rot that provides the illusion of grace and evolution rather than the stagnation of the swamp. This Cleanrot bypasses the traditional psychic defenses of the Imperium, as it is anchored in a biological reality that defies the laws of the Empyrean. The High Lords of Terra have designated Malenia as a Class Alpha extinction threat. Yet the more they strike at her influence, the more her spores are scattered by the very winds of war they create. Deep within the transformed hive of Ocularis, Malenia herself remains. She had become the heart of a new Haligtree, one whose roots now reach deep into the webway and the warp alike. She sits upon a throne of unalloyed gold and calcified bone, her eyes closed in a divine trance. She is no longer just a blade of Miquella. She is a sovereign of the scarlet bloom. Around her, the Cleanrot Knights stand in eternal, silent vigil, their numbers bolstered by the blessed remnants of a dozen different Astartes chapters and Xenos races. They wait for the moment the galaxy is ripe, for the moment when the third bloom will cover the stars not in darkness, but in a blinding, lethal crimson light. We are left to wonder, in a galaxy defined by only war, is a beautiful death preferable to a horrific life? The Death Guard have found a foe that cannot be outrotted. The Imperium has found a god that cannot be outprayed. And as the scarlet spores begin to drift toward the Segmentum borders, the laughter of the thirsting gods falters. For the first time in 10 millennia, something new is growing in the dark. Malenia has not come to conquer the galaxy. She has come to garden it. And in her garden, there is no room for the weak, the stagnant, or the emperor. There is only the rot and the bloom that follows. I am the chronicler of this anomaly, and may the God Emperor protect us all from the beauty of the end.